is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
This week marks the 10th anniversary of President Xi Jinping's proposal guiding China-Africa cooperation. Unveiled in 2013 at the Julius Nyerere International Convention Center in Dar-es-Salaam, Tanzania, the proposal has 4 principles. So what exactly are these principles, and how do they differentiate the way China engages Africa from Western partners? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts to further unpack for us the significance of this last decade and just how transformative it has been. Joining us from Johannesburg, Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, Research Director at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. In Nairobi, Dr. Adere Covins, International Relations Expert with a focus on China-Africa cooperation. And in Beijing, Professor Wang Yue, International Relations Expert. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you for being a part of this discussion. Dr. Adere, if I may start off with you, because 10 years ago, in March 2013, President Xi Jinping made a historic tour of Africa soon after taking office as the president of China. First off, by prioritizing Africa, what message was sent out by that visit?
I think it was important in several ways. It was first a continuation of a tradition that began nearly 2 decades earlier in 1991, when it became an official policy of the Chinese government to be sending top government officials to Africa, especially the foreign ones, during the first foreign trip of the year. But for President Xi Jinping choosing to come to Africa was also an indication that the president had placed the highest priority in terms of China's relationship with the continent. It was an indication of the historical significance that the two sides had enjoyed in terms of their collaboration and cooperation across a wide range of issues. And so it was revitalizing those traditional links, but it was also indicating a future where Africa would sit at the top of China's international relations priorities. And President Xi Jinping's trip actually, while it was a continuation, it was also a beginning. Africa was getting into a new form of relationship with China under a new leader. And that leader was here on the continent to reaffirm the commitment of China to continue with its cordial ties with the continent.
Professor Wang, let me get your view. What were the main goals of President Xi's visit to Africa all those years ago?
Well, Africa is the only continent that all the members, all the countries are developing countries. China, we are the biggest developing country, so we are the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So this veto power is for developing countries because it's African countries help China, the People's Republic of China, resume the legal seat in the United Nations in 1971. As Chairman Mao said, our African brothers help us to back to United Nations. So we should represent, we should support Africans' interests. And secondly, our policy is people first, people-centric domestically. Internationally, we also should pay more attention to the people. And the most young, dynamic, rising population is in Africa. So 85% of the world population, they are in developing countries. But their voices in the international society, global governance, relatively weak. Only the G7, the West, manage and dominate power. So we should support African integration, Africa's voice in the global governance. Of course, trade and business. African countries, they want to share the experience of Chinese modernization. 40 years ago, China's per capita GDP is only South Africa, Sahara of Africans, average, even less. But now, why China successfully modernized? Chinese people say, you want to build the road, get rich, build the road first, infrastructure building. So that reason we really heavily cooperate with Africans on the Belt Road Initiative to get the modernization, common prosperity.
All right, so let me get your recollections, Dr. Matambo, because we've heard about revitalizing traditional links, giving Africa the highest priority, trade and investment issues at the core of that visit. But what are your recollections of that moment? How did that visit reinvigorate China-Africa ties?
It has been rightly noted the two sessions of 2013 are just ratified President Xi Jinping's presidency in 2013, and then him choosing Africa as one of the first continents to visit was of historic importance. And secondly, he wanted to prove that what had been happening under President Hu Jintao would continue, the prioritization of Africa. Hu Jintao had made a similar trip to Africa in 2007, when he visited several African countries, and President Xi Jinping just wanted to show that despite the change at the helm of the Communist Party of China, Africa would still retain its importance in China's foreign policy. And obviously, there had been a lot of criticism on the African continent about the ineffectiveness of the structural adjustments program. So China came, so to say, with a model that, so to say, Africa can actually have a relationship that would yield good results different from the failure of the structural adjustments program. So Xi Jinping wanted to show that, yes, there are certain tangible results that could result from China's relationship with Africa. Thirdly, obviously, President Xi Jinping wanted to show as well that this development would be peaceful. Amity was the word that was used, but that peaceful development was a holdover from the presidency of President Hu Jintao. So there was some continuity to that.
Dr. Adere, two issues have come up here, the issue of sincerity and amity, because during his Africa tour, President Xi put forward 4 principles: sincerity, real results, amity, and good faith to boost China-Africa relations. How has China's relationship, therefore, with Africa evolved over the last 10 years? What do you think are the main drivers behind China's engagement with Africa?
It is important to note that at the time that President Xi was visiting in 2013, African countries were, struggling with the idea of development. And the traditional partners that the continent had not proven effective in terms of marshalling enough endogenous capacity to promote economic transformation of African economies. Now, if you look at the decade that has been since 2013, the same year that President Xi Jinping became president, he also, promulgated the now acclaimed Belt and Road Initiative, a framework that brought together 4 pillars, largely trade, people connectivity, political dialogue, financial inclusion, and infrastructure construction. Within the BRI framework, Africa and China have realized a number of development outcomes. Today, I think over 52 countries of the African Union have signed cooperative agreement with China in terms of implementing BRI. Over 6,000 kilometers of roads, over 6,000 kilometers of railways have been realized across the continent. The initiative has also seen implementation of a number of major ports, major energy projects, health projects, as well as agriculture projects. Today, China is Africa's largest trading partner for, I think, 13 years in a row since it overtook United States in 2009. Two-way trade between China and Africa stood at over 243 billion last year, and that is 4 times what Africa trades with the US. China today is also Africa's largest foreign direct investor, with a portfolio that is twice as large as that of the United States. Now, if you look at all this, data indicate that Chinese firms in Africa have contributed to over 20% economic development in the continent in the last decade, that is 10 years. So I think under President Xi Jinping, China and Africa have indeed realized very tangible, very practical, and very pragmatic development outcomes that have had real implications for the socioeconomic transformation and livelihoods betterment of the African people.
Right. Professor Wang, let's look at that actual realization, because real results was one of the issues at the core of President Xi's commitment to the continent. Analysts say that the president's policy on Africa therefore reflects a commitment to promote what you spoke about earlier, economic cooperation, trade and investment between China and African nations. How has the implementation of the 4 principles, though, impacted on China's Africa policy?
Well, firstly, sincerity. We will sincerely help Africa be more independent. Economic independence is a foundation for political independence. If you cannot have your highway, you cannot have your industry, how can you find jobs? How can you you can have your house, your own destiny? So when I fly to Africa, sometimes very ambiguous. Two neighborhoods that don't have a direct flight. Sometimes they need transfer from Paris to reach another Franco-African country. So it's ridiculous, right? So we need to integrate logistically, method Africans to be build more roads and railways and mutual connectivities. I think that's very important. African Union, they have the 2063 project. China, we have the Chinese Dream 2049, 2035. So the highlights of the principles of the BRIs, the synergies of the strategies. So Chinese Dream, African Dream, we can dream together. So that's basically sincerely help African can get a common prosperity, which is definitely different with the West, because in the past, the West colonized Africa, and today the West is more for financial, they are more high standard, exclusive, particularly for the US. So they are model interfere domestic affairs of Africa. So they are foreign aid, they are policy cooperation.
Right.
So not really help Africa get industrialized. China is different. China's modernization is inclusive. China's modernization is really want to share with African countries.
Right. I want to come to that point, Dr. Matambo, because Professor Wang has talked about the difference between Africa's traditional partners from the West and China's approach. In what ways, though, do you see China's approach to African development and diplomacy differing from that of Western countries? What has been the advantage here?
Well, the West believes in political universalism, and that is why the missionary zeal within which the Western foreign policy is couched is based primarily on the idea that what the West believes in are ideals that are universally and invariably applicable. So whether you like it or not, the West would want you to conduct your national and international affairs in a way that will reflect the West. China, on the other hand, believes in a relativist, so to say, or a cultural foreign policy, one that seeks to respect the internal or domestic affairs and circumstances of countries or elsewhere on the world. So that is a foreign policy that respects actually the fact that there are different ways, there are different circumstances that inform foreign policies. That is actually has been informed because of Africa's humiliating history with foreign and colonial domination, whereas everything that happened on the continent was dictated from elsewhere. So today Africa looks askance at any power that would come with a portfolio of ready-made policies that the continent should implement. And I think that is where the advantages resides with China, because China respects its principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of partner countries. Is kind of a very endearing principle on the part of China, and Africa respects that. Whether or not that has been effective will be the responsibility of Africa itself.
All right, let's now take a short break, and when we come back, we'll examine with some depth China's role in Africa's development and prosperity. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, Dr. Adere Kavins, and Professor Wang Yiwei. Professor Wang, a lot has been talked about the Belt and Road initiative, but the European Union has also unveiled the Global Gateway project to support infrastructural development around the world, which, you know, many perceive as some sort of competition to the BRI. In your view, are they comparable?
Actually, the gap between what the Africans' infrastructure investment need with what we have is very huge. So we welcome all of the investment to help Africa to lift the poverty, to reach the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations 2030. Okay, whether US, Europe, Japan, anybody, we very welcome. Which healthy competition provides up more opportunities, more choices for Africa, and then cuts the price lower. So it's good. But the problem is whether the Western, infrastructure building really can come to force. Even like the US and Europe, they domestically, they cannot invest so much of the infrastructure building because it costs lots of money. They don't have like China, the stay owner and the prices. So we can think about the long term. In China, with a model is the government created market, not the government just serves for the market. For instance, in China, we built it from Beijing to Tianjin. It's a 150 kilometers high-speed railway. 1 kilometer high-speed railway, the cost is 1 to 200 million yuan. So it's a debt maybe in China. But along this high-speed railway, if you build, and then the tourists, and then the real estate, all other categories of the industries will boom. So this is, we said, the cluster of the industries, and then economic zone, special industrial park, and then we can enjoy the prosperity in the long term to pay the debt. So that kind of model, the West cannot provide. So I'm very confident that we don't afraid of the competition. We welcome any competition if it's good for Africa. All of that, then very welcome.
Right. Dr. Matamba, what's your take?
According to estimates by the African Development Bank, we are running a deficit of infrastructure in Africa of over 100 billion United States dollars, and it might actually double in the next 2 years. So this just shows that there is a desperate need of infrastructure in Africa. But then how should Africa, so to say, accept infrastructure development, especially one that is of foreign provenance? The Belt and Road Initiative has been hugely successful in Africa. And now, obviously, we have to, the African Union especially has to study carefully the Global Gateway project and see whether or not it carries within itself the potential to realize the aspirations of Agenda 2063. But then we should be very careful, especially as Africans and the African Union in general, because what we are seeing right now could be a resumption of the Cold War. And we know exactly that during the Cold War, Africa was only of instrumental value to global superpowers. We were only important in as much as we helped to shore up the support of one ideological rival or belligerent against the other. That is not what we need at the moment. The Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Gateway project should be seen to work for the benefit of Africa, and not for Africa to be used as a pawn in the summit, in the global tussle, for domination that usually happens at the higher echelons of international affairs.
Right. Professor Wang, you know, some are worried that China may cut Belt and Road Initiative investment in Africa because of the long-standing debt issue. Do you think that's the case?
I don't think the existing projects, now you cut, this causes more costs. It's a burden not just for Africans, even for Chinese companies. Of course, will continue. But given that when the Chinese economic growth are also relatively slowing down, and it's not just a built infrastructure. Now, the slogan is we build more small and beneficial first, and lift the poverty, and also provide more jobs, and not just the infrastructure, which costs lots of money. So we are more focused on the e-commerce, digital, health, like CDC's new center. All of that is more Africans need. And also for the debts, because the infrastructure building, you definitely have debt, like China we did before. We borrow lots of money from World Bank, from Asia, from Structural Bank. But later, we pay back. So you need a long-term consideration. You need to cut the debt because of the Africans, including China, suffered the pandemic. So that's be the responsible. China volunteered to cut 77 countries from last years of the debts, and then provide the foundation for long-term economic growth, and then we can all pay back.
Right. Dr. Adera, you talked at length about the trade and investment portfolio between China and Africa. And we do know that the trade volumes between China and Africa have increased significantly over the past 2 decades. In fact, the annual volume of trade between China and Africa has jumped 24 times since 2000. What opportunities do you see for further growth and development?
Well, I think there is a lot of opportunity, especially when you look at trade around agriculture. Today, China is opening its markets wider to African produce. Kenya last year became the first African country to export fresh avocados to the Chinese market. And so many other, African produce, the Rwandan chili, the South African coffee and Ethiopian products are now increasingly accessing the Chinese market. And this is good, because China has also reduced over 98% of tariffs that could have impeded the entry of African produce into the Chinese market. Now, the increasing numbers in terms of trade are not happening in isolation. I think it is also important to identify the drivers. For example, the mutually reinforcing impacts of other pillars of the Belt and Road Initiative. Trade doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in political consultation. It happens in policy coordination. It happens when people-to-people ties are getting stronger. And all these pillars of the BRI are working in concert to create conducive environment for facilitation of trade. We are now thinking about moving the issue of trade into the e-commerce. China has consolidated a very good experience in terms of promoting e-commerce. We believe that as Africa implements the Continental Free Trade Area, that e-commerce is a component that can promote not just intra-Africa trade, but also promote trade between Africa and international partners like China. The other element is, of course, to improve the manufacturing capacity of the African countries. China has excess manufacturing capability that can be offloaded to some of these African countries to promote not just local exports, but also international exports, regional and international exports. We've seen, for example, Chinese companies, for example, operating here in Kenya that today make products that are sold regionally. And some of that can find their way back even into the Chinese market. So I believe that by attracting some of these light manufacturing industries from China, Africa can be in a better position to foster its manufacturing and value addition capability, because if you export value-added products, it have more value, it had more economic return than exporting raw products. So I believe there is an opportunity for China and Africa to collaborate around technology, around e-commerce, around manufacturing and value addition that can foster food security, but also economic development between the two sides.
All right, so let's get your winding up comments, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the discussion so far. Professor Wang, let me start off with you. And as you wind up the program, what are some of the key areas that you feel China and Africa can deepen their cooperation in coming years? And what do you foresee as some of the key challenges in achieving this?
The world is in a huge transformation from the traditional industrial to digital civilization. Low carbon, the green development is the dream for Africans and Chinese and the whole world. So these two transitions, I think, including the digital infrastructure and the new industries. So in China, we put data. We have the data, initiative for safety, security, and also digital infrastructure, e-commerce. All this developing very rapidly. So the slogan, the synergies of the Made in Africa 2063 with Chinese dream is Made in Africa with China for the world. Now, have more digital, infrastructure and also factories is, I think, it's very important. And also the green transformation. Now China has produced 70% of the e-vehicles, like BRD. All of this, we need to lift the poverty at the same time, also protect the environment. So that's produce more jobs and help Africa to increase the competitive advantage in the two transformations of the world.
All right, Dr. Matambo, your take?
We can talk about issues of industry, we can talk about issues of manufacturing, we can talk about issues of trade, but all those things, noble as they are, will never be for the benefit of Africa if Africa remains an unstable, continent that is susceptible to instability and that is susceptible to violence. So one of the first things that Africa's relationship with China should do is to make sure that it helps to transform Africa into a stable continent. So if those things are not taken into consideration, then whatever we are going to talk about will just be abstractions that will not be for the benefit of Africa. So Africa's relationship has to focus its relationship with China has to focus on security. It has to focus on issues of climate change, because these are things that are actually physical necessities for the survival of Africa. The rest will just be mere abstractions. And thirdly, obviously, I will emphasize a people-centered development, a development that is not only centered, that is not only tailored towards cuddling African odious regimes, but a development that is people-centered, a development that looks at what exactly is our relationship benefiting to the ordinary Africans, not only the people who are ensconced in the corridors of power.
Right. Dr. Nyerere, you have the final word.
Well, I think China and Africa have consolidated a very viable cooperative framework through different mechanisms. And these mechanisms have delivered value for the African people and for the Chinese people. I think at this stage, the real challenge is to master development. China is the largest developing country. Africa is still home to the largest number of developing countries. And the people who need this development the most are the ordinary people. So if we can focus this collaboration in critical areas, such as improving agriculture, which can help with food security, but also help with industrialization. If we can harvest some of the technologies and goodwill from China in green energy development and adoption, I think that can help Africa manage the impacts of climate change. But we also have an opportunity through initiatives of cultural exchanges, including tourism, that Africa provides a market, China provides a market, China provides, I think, the largest band of tourist travelers. As China gets out of the COVID situation, I think Africa is ripe for Chinese tourists, and this can create a stream of revenue for different governments. Of course, private-public partnerships is a model that has seemingly worked in a number of African projects implemented in partnership with China. We can see more so that we reduce the idea of public spending, but still deliver public goods to the people across Africa. So we can harvest some of these easier to do, early maturing development frameworks, so that the African people and the Chinese people can collectively really move forward to what is truly a shared future, which is prosperous for all.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. Joining us from Johannesburg, Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, Research Director at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. In Nairobi, Dr. Adere Cavins, International Relations Expert with a focus on China-Africa cooperation. And joining us from Beijing, Professor Wang Yiwei, International Relations Expert. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.